Elon Musk and some of these folks are trying to do, they have very optimistic viewpoints of how we can benefit from space and benefit for everyone. A lot of the policies stayed the same, relatively the same. There's a whole situation developing in space. There's always speculation out there about how China is increasing its technology so quickly.
Welcome back on the SpaceInfo podcast. Here we talk about space and everything related to it. If you are passionate about space, astronomy, technology and everything about it, you can join all our social platforms at the SpaceInfo Club or our website at www.spaceinfo.club, where tons of content and a community of experts are there waiting for you. This is the SpaceInfo Club. So, good morning, Mr. Ogden. Welcome on the episode. So, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
And okay, so for the people maybe who have already seen you on the platform, you've been interviewed by us, and the title of the article was Space Fundamental, and we exchanged some word with you. So maybe you just to tell us who you are, what are you doing, and what's your main occupation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and thank you for that interview on the platform. I really do appreciate it. As I stated in the interview on the platform, I am well. First of all, I'm Ben Ogden. I am a professor of strategic space studies at the U.S. Army War College. Only for about another 6 weeks now at the recording of this podcast, but that's what I've been doing. I've also been an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, the School of Advanced and International Studies, where I taught the Space Force courses on space power development. So I have been career military, the United States Army actually, but I've been teaching space now for the past, 4 years or so. And because of that, by the way, I have to say that all my comments today are my own comments and don't reflect the Department of Defense, so that's the standard line there. But that's what I do, and so I help educate people on what's going on in space, more at the strategic and policy level.
Okay, and I mean, already from the title of your job, I can see that people can understand how much importance is there now, particularly in America, about space and about how strategic this thing is actually. And I think now we all know under which light we should look at this topic today. And
Yeah.
we could start maybe with a very, I would say, hot topic now, because you mentioned the Army War College, and so we are also for sure military is involved in space as it was at the very beginning, but nowadays we've been seeing China, who is entering into this field. For sure, not in the last months. They are trying to get into this since years, but lately it seems that they've developed what they were missing in the past, and I'm talking about know-how, their capability to get out from the atmosphere. So, what do you think about this?
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. I think there's a whole situation developing in space. Across the board, of course, but militarily, it's a very interesting situation that's playing out. So if you go back, I would say maybe back to the Gulf War time frame when space was really publicized in terms of supporting military operations. We first saw GPS, we first saw satellite communications being used for regional conflict. Imagery, things of that nature. We saw how beneficial it was to the military on the ground, and so since that time, China in particular has really taken interest in trying to gain some of those advantages for itself. They have taken a very progressive and iterative steps towards having what the United States has militarily in space. Um, they've set up their own GPS network. They've set up their own, of course, they have their own communications. They've really gone in on satellite imagery as something they see as being very valuable to them, to their national security. And you see a lot of people in the Space Force talking about this now. Um, because China is trying to achieve parity with the United States in space militarily. Um, Still a ways to go, of course. The United States is pretty far ahead in terms of numbers of satellites and capabilities across the board. But China has definitely seen that space is essential in their military or future military operations, and they are taking a very methodical approach to even the playing field, I guess, if that's the right term, militarily. Um, I think we'll see continued competition going on there between what China's doing, what capabilities they're striving to get, um, and we'll have to see how this plays out strategically with the United States, of course, because as with any nation that starts to increase similar capabilities, the United States, at least in the past, has always tried to offset that somehow, and so that's kind of where the U.S. military is how do we offset China's increasing capabilities?
Yeah, so I was thinking about a couple of things you mentioned. The first thing is communication, which is probably the very first thing people think about when talking about satellite, putting things, I would say, generate things, for sure, not a very good words, into space. But actually, maybe you can just overcome communication in other ways if this is your only, I would say, final goal. But you mentioned imagery and Earth observation, so probably this is, I would say, an evolution of plane communication. If we are just thinking about audio or sending data from one point to the other of our planet, so I would say that the evolution of this is, Earth observation. And this is probably the first step we can think about when putting things in orbit. Just thinking about history, the very first launches in Earth orbit were not for people but for satellite. I'm thinking about Sputnik, which was for sure, I would say, a prototype, just a technological demonstration of being capable of doing something. But now I think that we are assisting to an evolution, and as you mentioned, is not just saying to the world, okay, I'm capable of launching something into orbit, but I have some use cases for this, and I will be using this. So the fact that they are now capable of exploiting this technology for their use, which is for sure the majority of the time is military, is probably the highest sign, the brightest sign of they that they have acquired a special know-how. And particularly about know-how, okay, even high evolution of this is putting humans into orbit. They've been doing this with their private, not that's not private, with their space station, the Tiangong
Hmm.
space station, and we have images, we have I would say independent observation of the thing. So that's not something which is only a mean of propaganda. So they actually did it, but as a technological demonstration, they're acquiring a lot of know-how. A lot of people are mentioning, I would say, almost some mysterious way on how they acquired this know-how. But we have seen that they are capable of landing a rocket back on the ground. We have seen only a few, I would say, images, and since a few months ago we haven't seen anything else. So maybe it's not just a very stable know-how, I would say, like that. but they did it. So, what do you think on this side? Some time ago, people said, okay, China is copying everything in the world, but they don't have that technological capability. But now it seems that they have actually.
Yeah, no, you're right. Um, there's always speculation out there about how China is increasing its technology so quickly. There are always people who say whether it's gathering the information through cyber means or um, any number of ways to where their intellectual property from some companies or even some governments are being taken. Um, to me, it how they're getting it, I'm not really that concerned about. What I'm more concerned about is how they are, like you mentioned, becoming so very good at a number of different um, types of space capabilities. You mentioned the types of launch, the numbers of launches that they have is just unbelievable from a country that is relatively new to space travel. Um, the space station and how quickly their space station went up was very remarkable. The activity we see in the headlines of what they're doing in and around the moon, the far side of the moon in particular, places where the United States has yet to master those types of maneuvers or things, or lunar return samples, going to Mars and having a very similar rover that the U.S. does. These things are all playing out, and of course are very concerning on the strategic competition perspective. Um, this is why I don't really particularly like to use the term space race that a lot of people do right now between China and the United States, because space race implies almost trying to be the first at something, or a head to head competition in one area, like it was with the Soviets. It brings connotations of that. This is a little bit more um, broad spectrum. There are a lot of areas that China is trying to close the gap with the United States, and quite frankly, they're doing it very well. As the points you just mentioned, some of the things I mentioned, and they're challenging the U.S. in every regard, and it's concerning just because, at least from the U.S. perspective, because there's a real chance that China could someday surpass the United States as the world's leader in space travel, space exploration, the use of space. And I think if you have a perspective of, like a Western perspective of we can't let that happen, because there's a fear out there that China will then have the leverage to implement the norms of behavior and the rules that we use in space, which may not be favorable to maybe a capitalist society or a democratic society. And so I'm not sure where you fall in on that, if you think that's a concern, but that definitely is something that many people, at least in space policy and space strategy, think of as that's one reason we can't let China dominate activity on the moon or beyond the moon, is because we may then be subject to them taking leadership in those areas.
Yeah, I think that this last point is one of the most important, the most, I would say, undervalued by people, because people use the term that you mentioned at the beginning. It was that is a space race. Actually, people are just looking at this as a, I would say, almost a sports competition. Okay, you only see one goal. That's the final. Like you are running 100 meters, and okay, that's your final goal. Okay, the first that arrives is the strongest. Okay, but then end of the game. But actually, that's not really what's the reality, I would say. And yeah, I think that having this very clear to people is just one of the most important thing that we can just make to start a proper communication of this of what's happening. Also, I really appreciated the fact that you say that this is not just I would say a punctual goal, so something that you achieve and then you forget, but it is also a sign of the evolution of the times we are living. Actually, is that you are we are seeing that this competition is actually not being the first in doing something. America landed humans on the moon first, but then it was something like, okay, we forgot how to do it again. We we did it for a lot of time, for almost 10 years, but then no one did it again. But it seems that now being the first is not so important, but doing things better than the others, being the best in doing this, and also not only once but more times, is the most important thing. Actually, to establish a continuous, I would say, control, or a continuous, I would say domination, but that's not the right term, in time. So yeah, I think that this is actually the point of the discussion.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. We're expanding our capabilities in space. We being the global space industry, really. Um, and so, but there aren't a lot of agreed upon business practices of how to safely operate in these new endeavors. And so, I mean, if you look at Starlink, for instance, and SpaceX, I mean, Starlink
Yeah.
is has done something that no one has ever done, is putting up hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites in a constellation, and they're doing it, and there's no laws that say they can't do it, but there are people who would disagree that they should be doing it because of a whole variety of reasons. From astronomers won't be able to see the night sky as easily as they used to um, Starlink's basically occupying certain orbital regimes that no one else will have access to, things of that nature. But it's happening, and so this type of um, precedent could happen in every other endeavor we have. And a lot of people are saying these same things could happen if one country or one company starts to occupy Lagrange points around the moon to a point where no one else can, or they're setting the rules of how activity happens in those points, or even on the moon itself. And I think that's the fear people really have is we don't know how this will play out, and we don't know what activities China or the United States, how they will go about sustaining presence there. But we in the United States want to be the first to do it because we know we will have rules of equality, and everyone will have a say, and more of the liberalism that comes with how the U.S. operates versus more of the authoritarian way that China operates. And I think that's the big fear right now.
Yeah, actually, I would use this last topic to introduce, I would say, another topic. I would left this for the end of the episode, but now I just have to mention it, and is this last thing. So, 2024 is the year of presidential elections in the USA, and this is another topic to say that okay, uh, China is having an authoritarian approach to this, but probably I don't know if it is in absolute terms it is the best. Okay, I would say not, but okay, I would leave the public to judge it. But for the for space, for this kind of long-term project, probably giving continuity in time, being with a correct approach under the political point of view or not is probably the best thing to ensure that a goal which is so distant in time can be pursued properly, I would say. We have seen a lot of changes in the administration of the, I would say, biggest country in the world, which is the one with the highest influential on all other nations, and probably this is probably I would say for sure it is not the best approach to give continuity. Changes in the budget, changes in the political, in the policy and probably this is just another step backward in this run probably. But for sure, I leave
Yeah.
you the word because you're far more expert than me in this.
No, no, I think you're onto something there. So, as you well know, doing anything or having objectives in space, it takes a long time relative to how things happen, let's say, on Earth or any other industry, because of the difficulty, the distances, the technology you've got to develop to really do something grand in space. It's going to take time. Just the physics alone is going to make it that way. Well, the United States operates under a very short political system. We're talking every 4 years for president, every 6 years for the Senate, 2 years for the Congress. Um, this obviously brings, if especially if there's a major change in political parties, a shift in policy potentially, and that could include space. And so if and this is something NASA's always had to deal with. I mean, NASA has always had grand ideas that may take years or decades to fully see through, but they have to survive the winds of political change that may be happening in the United States. And so it's almost it's definitely an obstacle, and I would say almost a disadvantage for the United States in this new strategic competition, um, because of the political cycles that we have to endure, each 4 years or however long it may be. Um, Now, luckily, I would say, at least from the last administration, the Trump administration to the Biden administration, a lot of the policies stayed the same, relatively the same. The Artemis Accords, the Artemis program stayed in place with pretty much the same objectives. The Space Force stayed where it was. Um, and so I think the good news, at least, regardless of who wins in November here in the United States, whether it's President Biden or President Trump, I think, they both have shown they kind of have the same space policy uh, in general. So you almost get some accidental consistency here, that's going to give the U.S. at least a boost to keep on the path that we're going. Now, that doesn't mean that whether whoever wins in November may not change the messaging that comes out in terms of how we're looking at space, but it seems to be that the policy will stay the same. But you're exactly right that the United States has to somehow get a persistent policy that's towards an end state to stay in front of China, who, by the way, China isn't subject to all the same changes we are, and so they can put out a plan like they have out to 2049 that says they're going to become the global space power by then, and they can steadily and methodically get to that end state without all the potential political turmoil that could come with it. Of course, anything can happen internally in China that could derail this, that we don't know. But at least as the two political systems put next to each other, it's the U.S. is going to have to pay a lot more attention to keeping on track in its space policy to make sure it stays ahead. Now, you know, that's the hard part because there are a lot of other things going on in the world, and governing is all about prioritizing the programs. And if something else becomes more of an urgent matter, then maybe space gets put on the back burner or to the wayside, and then that could be a problem in the long run.
Yeah, I think that this last thing is something that people usually don't see because people are very, we all are very focused on what we think is most important because we have, I would say, a perspective of our life. But yeah, politics is a matter of priorities. You have, you can see, I think you can see it as a box. You have basically some amount of money to spend, some budgeting. So that's limited for how huge it can be, but that's limited. If you have higher priority, you have to allocate different kind of money to that thing, to one other one. So you have to manage the resources you have. So yeah, if a priority comes higher, for sure space comes back in the ladder.
Yeah, and if I could to add on to that,
Yeah, sure.
something that um, I think we in the space community don't do very well that would help when some of these political challenges come up is we we haven't quite figured out a good way to show the average citizen how space is important to them. I mean, we at least in the West live in democracies. Um, Citizens vote for the politicians, and citizens have a voice. So the best way to get a space program fully solidified in your political system is to have the citizens, you know, advocating for it. And it's tough sometimes to make that connection between what's happening in space and a person's everyday life, right? I mean, we can all day say, well, you get GPS and that helps, and you get weather forecasts and things from space, and people, okay, you're right. But when you're talking about making hard choices, like you were just saying, about prioritizing certain government programs, you really have to make the case that space is critical to national power and national prosperity, which it is, but we really don't often communicate that very well. And so that's sometimes why space loses out in the end if there's a conflict of resources.
Yeah, no, I swear that was not, I would say, an agreed topic, this one, but I really thank you for having said this because is what we are trying to do today with this episode, what Space Info is trying to do with people with people which follow the platform because as usual with everything but particularly with space education and a constant information about what's happening is probably the best way to let people know we all don't want to influence or I would say influence the opinion of what people are thinking or are doing but just letting them know what's happening and I really think that with the education just being informed just knowing the fact what's happening actually is the strongest thing that you can do to let people choose but being able to choose with some knowledge on their shoulder so being able to know what they're looking for and actually I think this is one of the strongest thing and actually our mission so also I would like to thank you again for being here today,
Yeah.
for sharing your knowledge or your expertise because that's what we are trying to do. And just adding on what you're telling, we're talking about before, probably the fact that companies like SpaceX with projects like Starlink are doing, you actually say that yeah, they are doing anyway. You're what they want. They are trying to bring on Starlink, their constellation, without thinking too much regulation because actually we don't have real regulation. I could think that it could be a different point with what happened in the past. So, if in the past you only had the public sector, governmental agencies, things like this to give you money to fund your project. Now we have private companies with their objective, with their goals. Probably this now is something which is pulling the movement, pulling the project without just waiting for funds to come from the sky.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think um, the value. I didn't mean to put SpaceX in a bad light. That's not what I was trying to do, of course. Because I think what Elon Musk and some of these folks are trying to do, um, they have very optimistic viewpoints of how we can benefit from space and benefit for everyone. And so I think that's a positive that the private space industry is bringing to us is the possibilities of sharing space even more broadly among all the global citizens, right? Um, and so, but I think where companies like SpaceX sort of start rubbing people wrong, at least it's the space community they're not pleasing a lot of times because they're kind of just saying I'm going to go do this the way I want to do it. Um, at least it appears that way. And I don't care if you had plans on putting a constellation up. I was here first, and so and so I went. But I think overall, companies like that have genuine interest in helping out um, at least the global citizens on benefiting from things you can get from space.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Also, I would like that we all could think about how technology has progressed in time. Think about what was happening 100, 150 years ago. Things were very, very different, and for sure, for example, I'm thinking about when cars were invented. And okay, humans are quite stupid if you think that the first car accident happened when only two cars were actually in the world. Only in the whole world, only two cars, and they collided between each other. So we are not very smart when taking this kind of decision. But for sure, um, being able to develop, I would say, freely technology is probably the best starting point to make such ambitious project come up. So yeah, there is time, maybe not too much time. We are been seeing this with space debris to put regulation on what we are doing. So if people are not going to behave, I would say. Correctly, if probably that's not the best word to describe this. If people are not going to behave correctly, probably there will be so much space debris that a lot of projects will just fail due to external causes. But yeah, I think that just surrender to just because we are afraid of the consequences is not the correct approach.
Yeah, and I like that, and I like your automobile analogy. I mean, after those first two cars crashed into each other, what did we do? We started regulating, right? We put up stoplights, we put up stop signs, we put up literal rules of the road. You have to drive on, at least in the West, or at least most countries, the right side of the road, or a lot of countries. Um, you have to wear a seatbelt. All these things started coming to make that form of transportation and everything work to where we could benefit from it. And I think we're at that same point in space right now. And there's whole communities and great organizations and people really thinking about this to try to make sure we do it right. I'm just worried about the the technology and the activity happening quicker than we can put some of these in place. You know, as you know, the space activity and technology is just rapidly moving. It's moving so fast, um, and as we all know, regulation especially regulation at an international level goes at a snail's pace. It's pretty slow. You have to negotiate. There's votes. There's all this. But it's needed. But I just hope it doesn't reach a point where we're kind of putting these unwritten practices in place that will take a long time to get space participants to stop doing when the official regulations come on board. So, and I think that's the fear of a lot of people when you start talking about debris, you start talking about space sustainability. There's a sense of urgency to get it right, rightfully so. But then there's also this sense of, hey, let's let innovators innovate and build technology that will revolutionize the domain. So you can't have both. If you have both going at the same time, they're probably going at different speeds.
Yeah, that's for sure, and I think a topic that which is going in the same direction of what you mentioned is probably the I would say the different approach that public agencies have adopted, particularly in the U.S. In the last kind of 10, 20 years about budgeting, about giving money to the private sector. A lot of programs just came out from NASA and with the budget, with funds available for private companies. And I would just underline that the fact the different approach of giving funds to external company has changed a lot with respect to 20 years ago, for example. Because if you're thinking about a couple of decades ago, companies were contractor or subcontractor of a public project, and they just had almost unlimited money to reach a fixed goal. So, for example, if we said, okay, humans had to get back to the moon, this is our goal. Okay, no matter how money you want, we'll do it. Now things have changed. Where public agencies, okay, they keep on doing research, they keep on going in deep space. This is one side, but the other side is okay, you want to go in Earth orbit, you want to go on the moon. Okay, I give you a budget, I give you 50 million, 100 million, something like that. This is your money, and now it's up to you to decide on to think about how you reach your goal. I think that this is a very business-like approach, and it's becoming efficient by nature, because if you get the money, that's up to you deciding how to best use them. And I think on one side, this is just self-regulating on in the terms of efficiency of doing things at your best. You cannot afford to lose a spacecraft, a satellite, because you just want to try it out before going for the last flight, for example. And on one side, this is I would say a self-regulating mechanism. I would like to think about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think we have seen a culture shift, as you clearly pointed out there, in the last 20 years. The old model, like you said, was okay, NASA wants to do something. Okay, NASA would sit down and say, okay, here's kind of what we need, the technology we need, and then they would hire a company to go build that technology. It was very slow, very time consuming, very risk averse, right? Because it's taxpayer money going into this, and we didn't want any accidents, and so it took a while. But there was no urgency or need to go fast. It was kind of you know the Soviets were moving slower than we were, and it was just kind of this thing going on. Well, but what changed was, as you mentioned, the commercial sector came on board and said, hey, we really don't necessarily need the government to be a customer of ours. We can be our own space company in our own ecosystem. And if the government does want our services, we can sell to them, or they can purchase it. And I think what that's done is it's totally flipped everything on its head now, because now the government is any government space organization is forced to say, okay, the commercial sector is way ahead of us, or is way out in front, and, innovatively and technologically. Let's see what they're producing, and then maybe we can go and try to purchase off the shelf capability to help us do those things you were talking about, land on the moon, or communications or launch or whatever it is. And it's almost like a reversal of what we were doing the first 60 years of the space program. It is a reversal. And so I think I know that at least the U.S. government's approach through its policy is, hey, let's not over-regulate the commercial space industry, because we eventually want to be the benefactors of some of these technologies that they produce. And like you said, we're seeing large contracts being drawn up by NASA, by the Space Force, and saying, hey, parts of the consortiums that they deal with, I need this type of capability developed. Who can be the first one to go out and do it? And then they pose this big pot of money, and some of these companies will go out, and right now they're trying to develop ways to meet those demands. And so it's a really interesting time right now, and but I think what this also produces, and I don't know if you wanted to go into this, but it's a whole other topic. Especially with military acquisitions, it starts putting some of these commercial companies in a precarious position of being tied to military operations. and this is generating a whole set of legal issues for. I think we see it with Starlink in Ukraine right now, and all that, but it's creating a side effect of how commercial satellites and commercial activity is being seen. Is it commercial or is it for military purposes? And that's usually in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, but I think that this is probably we didn't need it, but now it's a clear sign of how large and how important this thing is becoming. For example, I'm thinking about the wars of the last century, and okay, you say that, yeah. Now we are talking about Starlink, which was, I would say, not converted but just employed on the Ukraine and Russia war. But if we think about, for example, the industry of the early 40s or the early 30s, in case of war, they would probably be converted into weapon machinery, weapon production. So probably this is a kind of analogy on this side. I'd like to see it under this point of view. I'm in Europe. I've studied the history of some, I would say, companies which are still here nowadays, but in the 30s, in the 40s, for example, for the Second World War, they started producing weapons or just pallets, for example, and things like that. Even though they probably produced something like cars or kitchens, for example, there are a lot of examples here, and yeah, we are just looking at, I would say, the third millennium phenomenon, but
Yeah,
the analogy is quite clear in my point of view.
yeah, yeah. There's certainly some validity to that as well. Um, at least from my point of view, I think what might be a little different that we're still trying to figure out is at least in those times, especially the post-war or the interwar periods and of the major wars anyway. Um, it seems now that this, for instance, Elon Musk, a CEO of a company, can just unilaterally put himself into a national security type situation with the capability he has. Now, I'm sure there's dialogue that's going on with the U.S. government with all of it, but I think the power that commercial space companies are bringing, um, I think at least legally, the U.S. is kind of struggling on the right way to use them and make sure that they are still seen as commercial entities and not subject to tampering or being threatened by any other military. So yeah, it's a dilemma I'm still working through.
Yeah, actually now I've studied yeah, space engineering at the university, and one of the things that my professor said in the course of launch system was, okay, now we have the probably a lot of knowledge or the right knowledge to build to choose to build if you want to build an intercontinental weapon or just a rocket. So yeah, probably the military, I would say, approach, or the military shadow is always present in these kind of operations. But yeah, that's probably for some people is not a good thing to say or to think about. But a lot of innovation came from that side in history. We have history to look at. So yeah, I think that in the past the trend was basically the same, at least under this point of view, and we are just getting better in employing using technology, I would say, because if we think about the quality of life, quality of yeah, in general of life, now we are just improving in a very high pace. But yeah, the shadow is always present, but it's not a negative thing, at least in my point of view. And yeah, now I think we have just a last topic, and I left this at the end, so we can just think about evolving from our planet to the moon. And okay, so we can just transport the privatization we were talking at the beginning into, I would say, colonizing uh, this satellite. And I think that we are just trying to bring communication. We mentioned at the very beginning of the episode imagery and also our activities. We are trying to bring them to that satellite. So how do you see this kind of project?
So, are you saying? Sorry, let me understand the question. Are you talking
Mhm.
about lunar activity? How are we approaching it? Or
Yeah, yeah. Also under the light of what we say with China, also with the, I would say, the military approach. Again, for me, is probably is a very strong background on how to face this challenge. Probably the best one because it gives you the strongest instrument to face this kind of challenge.
so when we talk about the the I guess we could call it the race back to the moon. Um, yeah, there are I think there's a lot of speculation right now from a lot of people on why we're going, what's going to happen when we get there. Is there a military purpose of being there? I've seen lots of debates on it. Um, I, I think it's you mentioned it earlier. I think at least the moon is the next evolutionary step. And what I mean is we have been living literally with our astronauts in low Earth orbit for almost a quarter of a century now, 20 over 20 years with the International Space Station. And I think is that as as we now have a little bit more information about the moon and what it possibly has in terms of scientific discovery, in terms of resources, um, etc. I think it's the next logical step for countries to now push out to the moon and you know start figuring out how to sustain presence there. So think of it as like the next version of the International Space Station, but it's actually on the moon, right? It's at least that's how NASA sees it. China supposedly says, they're in it for the same thing. They're just competing with the United States to have its own research station and things of this nature. But I think where the national security and the military implications come in is is on this potential resource availability from the moon. Um, I don't know if there's much military value that would occupying the moon would give a country that would give them an advantage, a military advantage on Earth from the moon. That's a very hard sell for me. I think for me, the value in the moon lies in potential resources. It's an economic game, really. Who can establish themselves, begin potentially finding economic value on the moon, and somehow getting it back to Earth to benefit that nation on Earth. I think that's the bigger national security implication. Of course, there's a scientific arm to this. I mean, anything we're doing on the moon is going to get scientific value, as we know. Um, and so I think that's what's playing out, really. But there are some people that are a little more hawkish and saying, no, we just need to go ahead and militarize everything we can around the moon because eventually, like everything else in human history, there will be conflict and fights over those resources and things. So we need to be prepared to do that. Again, there's a lot of people that have, depending on what industry they're in, have a different point of view of how we should approach the moon. But at least militarily, right now, um, there's there's not much in U.S. strategy in terms of cislunar operations militarily. I know they're trying to evolve that strategy, but right now it's more focused on the scientific approach of the Artemis program. So that's kind of where I stand with it. And I think NASA's point of view of having it being more of a research and scientific venue for potential future and further space travel seems more the pragmatic approach right now.
Yeah, I completely agree in what you said, and yeah, actually that's also what I'm thinking about, and probably I would say our side of the world will be I would say lead by will be leading by example under this side. Maybe it's just a stupid thing on what I'm thinking. Probably the world would never change, but yeah, we can try. We can just give our example on this.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm really thankful for this episode. So thank you so much, Ben, for being here, and thank you for bringing your knowledge and also all your expertise in this field. Hope to have you back again soon. I
a-
really enjoyed this.
absolutely. It's been a pleasure. And as I unintentionally said in the middle of this, I think Space Info Club and what you're doing and the education of a broader audience is key for the entire space industry. So I appreciate it, and I'd love to be back anytime.
This is the Space Info Club.